Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where each story is a window into the heart of humanity. Today, we bring you a tale that will stir your soul, a story of hope, selflessness, and the unexpected connections that can change lives forever. Join us as we journey through the streets of New York, where a poor boy's act of kindness saves a millionaire's daughter in ways no one could have ever predicted. It was another blistering day in New York City, the sun relentless as it bore down upon the streets of East Harlem. The concrete, already hot enough to burn bare skin, shimmered in the heat, and the city buzzed with life. Yet for Ethan, everything felt strangely still. He stood there, his back leaning against a street lamp on the corner of 145th and Broadway, eyes staring out at the stream of yellow cabs, luxury sedans, and tourists clambering out of Uber rides. The cars seemed to race by, as if they were all running away from something. Just like him, at 12 years old, Ethan wasn't supposed to feel so much weight on his shoulders. Yet, there he was, clutching a small box of candy, hanging from a frayed string around his neck, hoping to make a few dollars before the day ended. His palms were slick with sweat, his brow dotted with beads of moisture. But there was no relief to be found. It was hot. The city was suffocating. But Ethan wasn't thinking about the heat. He had other things on his mind. "Come on, please," he muttered under his breath, glancing around at the pedestrians as they passed by. It was always the same, people hurrying along, faces glued to their phones, too busy to notice him, too busy to notice anyone who wasn't already part of the system. But today had to be different. Ethan's mother, Linda, was at home, still battling the sickness that had been eating away at her for months. The doctor's bills were piling up, and every day the medication she needed seemed to cost more. It was hard to think of her that way, weak, pale, lying in bed while he ran the streets of the city. But he had no choice. He needed the money, and the only way he could get it was by selling these stupid little candy bars. Candy for $1. Please help a kid out." The words felt rehearsed, mechanical, as if he had spoken them 1,000 times already. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. A few drivers gave him a sympathetic glance. One or two even nodded, shaking their heads in pity. Ethan sighed and moved to the next car in line, tapping gently on the window. "Candy, sir?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Just $1. Help a kid out." The man in the car barely looked at him. He just rolled up his window without saying a word, leaving Ethan standing there, staring at the gleaming black car door, feeling more invisible than ever. His eyes wandered to the corner of the street. A woman had paused to tie her shoes. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, her face drawn and tired. Ethan had seen her before, probably from his time spent walking the city streets, trying to make enough for food, for anything to keep going. He didn't expect her to notice him, but she did. "How old are you?" "Kid." Her voice was kind, though tinged with concern. 12. "Ma'am." "Just 12, he answered quickly, adjusting the candy box around his neck, his fingers trembling a little. She stared at him for a moment, and Ethan could tell she was thinking. Then she rolled down her window and slipped him a few coins. Ethan's heart leapt in his chest as he accepted the money. He didn't even care how much it was. It was something, at least. "Thank you. God bless you," he said, a tired smile tugging at the corners of his lips. But the woman didn't smile back. Instead, her eyes softened with sadness, and she reached out to touch his arm briefly, as if she were trying to comfort him in some way. "Take care of yourself, kid," she said quietly before rolling up her window and driving off. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, staring after her, feeling the heat of the street pressing down on him again. He looked at the coins in his hand and slipped them into his pocket. He'd take what he could get, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. What would he do if this wasn't enough? What would happen to his mom? The light turned green, and he quickly moved to the next car. He tapped on the window again, repeating the same tired words. "Candy for $1. Sir, please." But this time, there was no response. And as the minutes ticked on, Ethan's hopes began to fade. Eventually, the rush of traffic slowed. A few cars made their way through the intersection, but the crowd was thinning out. Ethan knew it was time to leave. The street was no longer filled with the energy of the city. Instead, it had turned quieter, almost somber, like the world had forgotten he existed. The only sound now was the hum of distant voices. A few cars still going by, but the air felt thick, heavy. He was tired. He took one last look at the candy box hanging from his neck. A small part of him wanted to throw it all away, to give up, but he couldn't. Not yet. With a resigned sigh, he turned around and started to make his way home, back through the narrow streets of East Harlem, past the peeling paint of rundown houses, each one telling its own story of struggle and survival. As he walked, Ethan's thoughts turned to Linda. He hadn't sold much candy today. He hadn't made enough. It wasn't enough. When he arrived at the small apartment, he opened the door carefully, his heart heavy in his chest. "Mom, I'm back," he said softly as he stepped inside. His mother's voice was faint but warm. "Ethan, you're home already?" "Yes, Mom. I sold a few candies today, but it wasn't much," he answered, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I'll try again tomorrow. I promise." He walked toward her bed, where Linda lay, her face pale and drawn. Ethan could see the weariness in her eyes, but she smiled at him weakly. "You're doing everything you can, my dear," she said, her voice full of concern. "But I worry about you, out there in the streets." Ethan sat down beside her, taking her frail hand in his. He knew she didn't want to worry about him, but she did, and he hated seeing her like this. "I'll figure something out, Mom. I promise," he whispered, brushing her hair gently from her forehead. "We just need a little more time." Linda smiled at him, though it was a sad, tired smile. "You've always been so brave, Ethan. Your father would be proud of you." Ethan flinched slightly at the mention of his father. He hadn't heard that name in so long. Not since everything had changed. "Let's not think about that now." "Okay," he said softly, swallowing hard. "Let's focus on getting you better." Linda nodded, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. She looked so small, so frail lying there. Ethan's heart broke every time he saw her like this. But he couldn't let himself break. "Not yet. I'll try to rest, darling," she murmured. "Thank you for everything. I'll make something for us to eat," Ethan said, standing up slowly. He moved to the kitchen, his mind still racing with thoughts of how to make more money. The medicine was getting more expensive. Time was running out. The city felt bigger than him, an unstoppable force. But he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. As he prepared a simple meal, he thought about the next day, and the next, and the next. It was all he could do. Keep going. Keep fighting. For her. As the light turned green, the woman's car pulled away, and Ethan was left standing on the corner, his fingers still clenched around the coins she had given him. The clink of the change in his pocket was the only sound in the otherwise bustling city. It didn't bring him much comfort. Nothing ever did. It was just another reminder of how little he had, how little he could do. The streets began to clear, and Ethan's mind shifted back to his mother. She was waiting for him, alone at home in their tiny apartment. As he walked back down Broadway, past the rundown shops and vacant storefronts, he thought about the silence that awaited him. His mom didn't complain. She never asked for anything more than he could give. But Ethan knew she was tired, too tired to fight anymore. And though he was young, he could feel the weight of her illness pressing down on her, pressing down on both of them. His steps quickened as he made his way through the narrow alleyways of East Harlem, the familiar sights and smells surrounding him. A man was sitting outside a deli, smoking a cigarette, his eyes fixed on the passing crowd. The neighborhood was rough, but it was home. The peeling paint on the walls, the faded street signs, the cracks in the sidewalk. It was all part of the world Ethan knew. A world that, on days like today, felt too small for his dreams. When he reached their apartment building, he hesitated at the door. The small hallway smelled of stale air, a mix of old wood and cleaning supplies. He had seen better days, but it didn't matter. None of it mattered as long as his mother was okay. "Mom!" Ethan called softly as he stepped inside. From the living room, he heard her faint voice. "Ethan, you're back already?" He stepped into the room, where Linda lay on the couch, a thin blanket pulled over her legs. Her face was pale, and her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. She smiled weakly when she saw him, though it was more out of habit than anything else. Ethan smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. He had nothing to smile about. "I sold a few candies today, Mom," he said, sitting down beside her. His fingers drummed nervously on his knee. "But it wasn't much. I'll try again tomorrow." Linda nodded slowly, her hand brushing his. "Don't worry, Ethan. You're doing everything you can. I just don't want you out there on the streets all day. It's too dangerous." Ethan looked at her, his heart heavy. She was right. The city was dangerous, especially for a kid his age. But he had no choice. She needed the medicine. The bills were piling up, and every day felt like they were running out of time. "I'll figure something out, Mom," Ethan said, his voice firm. He didn't know how, but he had to. "We just need a little more time. I'll get the money somehow." Linda gave him a tired smile, her hand brushing his cheek. "You've always been so brave, Ethan. Your father would be so proud of you." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach at the mention of his father. He didn't like to think about him, about how he had disappeared from their lives, leaving them with nothing but empty promises and broken dreams. He didn't want to remember. He didn't want to bring it up. So, he gently interrupted his mother. "Mom, let's not think about that right now. Let's just focus on getting you better." "Okay." Linda closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather the strength to speak. "You're right," she whispered. "I'll try to rest for a bit. Thank you, Ethan, for everything." Ethan stood up, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'll make us something to eat," he said, his voice soft, though there was no real warmth behind it. The small kitchen was cramped, the stove barely working, but he managed to put together a simple meal. It wasn't much, just a pot of soup and a few slices of bread, but it was something. As he sat down across from her, Ethan felt the weight of the day press down on him. The silence between them was thick, heavy, as they ate in quiet. He couldn't stop thinking about the candy he had sold, about how little he had earned, about how hopeless everything felt. But he didn't let it show. He couldn't. He had made a promise to his mother, and he wasn't going to break it. That night, as they finished eating and the room grew darker, Ethan whispered, "Tomorrow will be a better day. Mom, I promise." Linda nodded faintly, her eyes closing. "I know, Ethan, I know." And as he lay in bed that night, his mind raced, still searching for a way to make things right. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he couldn't stop trying. Not now, not ever. The silence that followed felt both comforting and suffocating. Ethan rose from his seat and headed toward the small kitchen at the back of the apartment. The fridge was nearly empty, but there were always just enough scraps to make a simple meal. He opened it, glancing at the half-empty shelves before settling on a couple of cans of soup. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he heated the soup on the stove, his mind wandered back to the street. The coins in his pocket were heavy, a constant reminder of how little he had. He tried not to think too hard about it, but the weight was always there, gnawing at him. Every day was a struggle. Every dollar he earned felt like a fleeting victory, knowing that tomorrow would be just as hard, if not harder. Ethan ladled the soup into a chip bowl, the steam rising in a soft cloud. He carried it back to the couch, setting it gently in front of his mother. Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled faintly as she saw the food. "Thank you, Ethan," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She picked up the spoon, but her hand trembled as she brought it to her lips. Ethan watched her for a moment, his heart aching. She was so frail now, her once vibrant energy drained by the sickness that had taken hold of her. "You don't have to thank me, Mom," Ethan said softly. "I'll make sure we're okay. I promise." Linda took another slow spoonful, her gaze fixed on the bowl, not meeting his eyes. For a moment, there was a kind of understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that neither of them knew what the future held, but that they would face it together. When she finished eating, Linda set the bowl aside and sank back into the cushions of the couch. Ethan sat beside her, his mind still racing with thoughts of the next day. He couldn't keep doing this forever. He needed a real solution. Tomorrow, He would sell more candies. He would find a way. Maybe he could convince someone else to buy from him. Maybe he would find someone who would see the desperation in his eyes and help him. It wasn't much, but it was all he could hold on to. As the night grew darker, Ethan sat there in the quiet apartment, watching his mother drift in and out of sleep. Her breath was shallow, her body barely moving. It was as though time itself had slowed down in this small room, as if the whole world outside had become distant and irrelevant. In this moment, nothing mattered except the promise he had made. Tomorrow will be a better day. Mom, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. I promise. The next morning came too quickly, the sun rising as it always did, without care for the struggles of those beneath it. Ethan woke early, his body stiff from sleeping on the small couch. His mother was still asleep, but he knew she wouldn't stay that way for long. She had her good days, and she had her bad days, but neither of them had much time for either. Ethan grabbed his box of candy and stepped out into the streets once more. The world was already alive, people hurrying to work, cars honking, taxis speeding by. But to Ethan, it all felt like noise. The noise of a city that didn't see him, didn't care for him. But he didn't need the city to see him. He only needed to keep going, keep trying. As he stood on the corner of 145th and Broadway, repeating the same words to the drivers who passed by, he noticed something different. A man in a tailored suit rolled down his window and offered him $1. The man's eyes were kind, but there was something else there too, something that Ethan couldn't quite understand. Keep it up, kid, the man said, handing him the bill. You've got the right spirit. Ethan took the money without a word, feeling the weight of the bill in his palm. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the man drove off, Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at the dollar in his hand. It was small, but it was a step forward. And for Ethan, that was enough. Tomorrow, he would keep trying. He had to. For his mom, for them both. Thank you for watching and sharing in this powerful story. We hope it inspired you to see the world through someone else's eyes, to recognize the silent struggles around us, and to appreciate the small acts of kindness that can change the course of a life. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that touch your heart.